The title of tonight's talk is supposed to be When Things Begin to Change and Tradition comes under attack, as it were, from the right and the left, or left and the right. Chronologically, it goes the right and the left. I'm going to speak tonight, first of all, about Hasidism, but in a different way than perhaps you're used to hearing about it, because I'm going to speak about it as a historic phenomenon in its relationship as a movement and a new movement in the context of the 18th century and traditionalism and the changes that kick in later. Believe modern movements in Jewish history. I know they don't look modern. They try to act. No, seriously. No. Their self-image is one. The one they project is one that this is the way it's always been. In fact, if you go to Williamsburg, you'll find pictures of Megillah Esther, where Esther is dressed like a chassid and Mordecai is dressed with a shtreimel and all the rest of it. But you and I know, and they do too, that that's not actually true. In point of fact, there never was such a thing as Hasidic Rebbe before the 1700s. We know when the Baal Shem Tov lived. He was born around 1690, he died in 1760. That's a fact. So you know that it is a movement that begins in the beginning of the modern period, or the end of the early modern period. It's a 1700s thing. It's an 18th century phenomenon. There was no such thing as a Hasidic Rebbe beforehand. The Rambam would have loved to have the kind of power that a Hasidic Rebbe arrogates himself and is granted. So would the Rashi, even the Talmudic rabbis, who, if you look over it, Moshe Rabbeinu would like to have that kind of power. The Jewish people don't listen. Why are you laughing? The whole Chumash is full of cases where he says, do this and do that, and they don't. And they challenge it. And if you look at the Midrashim and the Chazals, it's even worse than that. So this is a modern phenomenon. Now, in order to understand what's going on, you have to go back a little bit to what's one of the basic trends that kick in the early modern period, the 1500s, and that has to do with Kabbalah. Okay? As anybody knows, even in the Chumash, and certainly in the Tanakh, and certainly in the Mishnah, there are mystical elements. There are passages in the Bible and in the rabbinic literature which clearly are mystical in nature, not to be understood literally. It cannot be. To give the most obvious example, the Ma'asim are covered in one fine sequence in the book of Ezekiel. God's driving around on a chariot. You understand that he's not describing God driving on a chariot. That doesn't mean you know what it means, but you understand that it's mystical. Anybody who knows the Mishnah, and many do, and Chagiga knows that they talk about there are certain things you teach only to a class of one. And so clearly they're not talking about halacha, they're talking about some kind of mystical content. Again, it doesn't say what it is. That's indeed the point. It's going to be some kind of secret, esoteric understanding of the Torah, Judaism, which is to be communicated in the smallest possible circles. But the Gemara doesn't really describe what it is. The Torah doesn't describe what it is. The Nevi'im don't describe what it is. So it's out there. The Rambam knows about this also. It's out there, but it never was defined. When you get to the 13th century, in the midst of the great Maimonidean controversies, which means the big fights that tore Jewry apart in southern France and in northern Spain, there in southern France, Provence as they called it, in northern Spain, which was closely allied to it at that time, in the 1200s. There were big fights after the death of the Rambam over definitions of what's allowed to be believed or correct to be believed within Judaism. No, there's theological debates within Judaism, which is very rare. Usually in Jewish history there are no arguments over theology, just different opinions, and they never sought for any kind of precision. But the Rambam was into that, as you know, and after his death it left a very controversial legacy, and people fought about it. Families grew apart, people even killed each other and so forth in the course of the 1200s, and the result is that there were big debates over, to use a word that you'll be familiar with today, over Slifkinism, something along those. It's not the same thing. No, but seriously, it's not the same thing, but it's that kind of set of arguments. In the middle of all that, around 1280 or so, this rabbi in Spain publishes a book, which he calls the Zohar, and he says that it's 1,000 years old, and it goes back to Shem Yochai, and it is a mystical commentary on the Torah, from the Parsha of the week. And although there are people that say it's not true, and you made it up, and all the rest of it, Lamaisa, what happens is that the Gedolei Israel, over the course of the next 200 years, in the 1200s, the 1300s, the 1400s, accept it. And they say it really is true, it's not a fake thing. And therefore it represents an entire separate level, an entire new layer of rabbinic literature. In addition to all the books you have from the Tanakh, in addition to all the many, many books you have by the 1200s own rabbinic literature, the Talmud Bavli, and Yerushalmi, and all these other things that people know, and what we call the Rishonim. Now there's an extra layer called the Kabbalah, because that's what he says. He says either you believe it or you don't, and you have to be makabel it, you have to accept it. And people do. By and large, they do. There are a few exceptions, that are known, but overall, it does happen. And this is a trend which magnifies many times over about 300 years later. Oh, you don't get it. When the Jews are kicked out of Spain in 1492, and they emigrate to the Eastern Mediterranean, to the Turkish Empire, most of the Jews end up in the Balkans and Asia Minor and Syria and places like that. But some of them, as we all know, ended up in Eretz Yisrael, in the Turkish province of Palestine. And there's a famous group of Kabbalists that end up in the city of Tzfat in the 1500s. It becomes a center. Since a few of them were there, others moved there, and eventually you have the greatest of all the Kabbalists, which is the Arizal, who dies in 1572. And they basically, particularly the Arizal, boils down to him getting a new kind of nevuah. That's, they don't use the word, but that's what it amounts to. And the result is you have an entire new layer of understandings, Kabbalistic and otherwise, to be superimposed on what's already there. It was new stuff because he was the first one who told about it. And again, people didn't say that he's deluded or anything like that. They said he is what he says he is. Nobody knew him. I mean, he only lived in a short area of Tzfat. And he only interacted with a small number of people, but the word got out and it came to be believed by everybody. So therefore, it became an integral part of Judaism from the late 1500s and by the time you get to the 1600s. He died in 1572. He didn't write anything, but his main Talmud was a Chaim Vital, who died in 1620. He also didn't write anything, or he wrote a whole lot, but he wouldn't allow it to be published after he died. It's a long story, but he had all the writings buried, and years later, two Kabbalists said that they got a dream from him and allowed it, where he said you can take the stuff out of the grave. And this is how it gets out in driblets, here and there. Nobody understands all of it necessarily, but everyone understands a piece of it. And this radically impacts upon the Jewish people in the 1600s. And the result had all kinds of new ideas, new insights in the Torah that no one ever heard of before. And it had a very interesting differentiation geographically between its impact on the Sephardim on the one hand and on the Ashkenazim on the other hand. The way it impacted on the Sephardim was when they heard all these new ideas and doctrines and ways of looking at the Torah, they said, okay, I guess we were wrong until now, or at least we've been vouchsafed a new type of revelation or understanding of the Torah. For some reason, God decided the 16th century should be the time to reveal more about himself. Perhaps it's due to the fact that we're kicked out of Spain and we're in a pre-Messianic era, because obviously the expulsion from Spain must be connected with heavily Mashiach, something along those lines. And they redeemed. It's not what they had in Spain way back when. And most of the minhagim that they have now, the Sephardi Jews, I'm talking about the real Sephardi, the ones that end up in the Turkish Empire, are not identical as what you're going to find in the Middle Ages before 1492 that they practiced in Spain. It's interesting. They changed a lot. The most famous example, to give you one example, would be kaparas, right? Swinging a chicken around your head. So I'm sure many know that the classic Sephardic poskim back in the Middle Ages, the Rif, the Rambam, people like that, prohibited doing the chicken thing. They said it's pagan, it's Darkei Amori. And this even is incorporated in the Shulchan Aruch. See, Rabbi Yosef Kar, who was a Spanish Jew, who left Spain in 1492 when he was a little kid, and who is very into Kabbalah. But nevertheless, when he's doing the Shulchan Aruch, he presents the normative Sephardic halachic tradition and says it's prohibited as paganism to do the thing with the chicken. The Arizal, however, explains that although it looks like something objectionable, in point of fact, the swinging of the chicken, the idea of the transference, has deep Kabbalistic meaning. And the result is that the Sephardim in the 1600s changes. Okay, then we'll do it. And as you know, down till today, it's a well-known Sephardic custom, even though once upon a time was totally primitive. You can do this across the board. I just picked one interesting and piquant minhag that all of us are familiar with. But they basically had no trouble reinventing themselves, to changing. By contrast, and this is true incidentally of the Sephardim in general, that down the ages, very often, I don't want to get too technical over here, but very often down the ages, they moderated, they modified, they changed. By contrast, when you hit Ashkenaz, in other words, when the doctrines of the Arizal in the 1600s get to here, Poland and Germany, where the Ashkenazi Jews are, runs into a problem, because the Ashkenaz Jews, their very piety itself was of such a nature that it included, as I tried to indicate last week, an extreme sense of veneration for the past ancestors. That's not all that Ashkenazic spirituality is composed of. As we said, there's a very heavy element of cultural insularity, and there's other factors in it as well. But a very, very important part of it is what you and I would call as a code word, minhag. Right? If this is the way they did it, then this is the right way. If this is why Bubby and Zadie did, and particularly if this is what their Bubby and Zadie did, I don't want anybody to tell me it's wrong, because you don't know who they were. Unbelievable people, especially if they were killed at the stake, as often happened, for example, in the Crusades, in which case they literally were Kedoshim. They literally were Kedoshim. In that case, any practice that they implemented is to be understood as the Holy of Holies. And you had a classic example with the introduction of what the historians call the Lurianic ideas of Yitzhak Luria, that's the Arizal. You had a classic example of a clash between the irresistible force versus the immovable objects. That the irresistible force of Lurianism, of the new Kabbalistic ideas, which were taken by everybody and seen as real and true and representing, God's will in a deep way, on the one hand, versus the fact that the minhagim, the way we've been doing it until now, is the way we've been doing it until now. And I don't want to hear that there's anything wrong in the slightest degree in the way my father, or particularly my grandfather, great-grandfather, put on tefillin, observed Shabbos, kept Pesach, or anything else. And indeed, we find in the 1500s, already in the 1600s, a very strong opposition on the part of the leading Ashkenazi rabbis, like the Maharshal, for example, to the introduction of any kind of Kabbalistic customs which would contradict what is being done already. In a very famous tshuva, the Maharshal, who was a Gadol Ador in Poland, you've heard the name before, Shlomo Luria, and he's a question about should he put the tefillin on standing up or sitting down and so forth. And the Ashkenazic ways to do it one way, the new ideas coming out of Eretz Yisrael say to do it a different way, it has a deep meaning and all the rest of it. And he says, I don't care if Shimon Yochai, this is what he writes, I don't care if Shimon Yochai walks in this room right now. He's wrong. That's what he says. In other words, he's entitled to his opinion. That's not what we do. Obviously, we must follow the opinion of other great rabbis in the Mishnah, because my father did it. I know he knows what he's doing. It's like today, if you would say, can you eat this food? He said, I saw the Chavetz Chaim eating. That's it. He's not going to eat something straight, right? It's a kind of spirituality which is extremely personalized. If you know who this person was, then there's nothing to talk about. If he did it, then that's the end of the discussion. So it's the irresistible force in one versus the immovable object. A key example of this, which will kick in what I'm going to talk about in a minute, is, for example, the prayer book, the Siddur. The Arizal says, among other things, and I'm sure that people are familiar with this, that prayer is not just a simple thing of praying. And if you don't do it in the right way, it doesn't work. Right? It's a science to it. There's a science to prayer. In the ancient times, he said, or the Karmel records that he said, there were different tribes. We read today Parshat Vayetze. Tonight is coming after Parshat Vayetze. You have the 12 Shvatim born. It's not just a story about the adventures of Yaakov in Aram Narayan. It's not just a story of how his 12 children are born. Each child represented a certain part of the neshama of Klal Yisrael. That's how he would put it. And therefore, what it means is like this. If you're a Ruvain person, you can't pray from a Shimon Siddur. If you're a Yisachar person, you can't pray from Binyamin Siddur. Because your Shorish neshama, as he would put it, the nature of your soul has a certain DNA, if I can use that term. And the prayers are formed not simply as words, as rhetoric, but they have Kabbalistic, almost magical meaning. And therefore, in order for you to pray in the correct way, or as we would put it in a simplistic manner, in order for you to get your prayers into the right door, you have to have the right siddur. And really, if you're from Yehuda and you pray from Binyamin, it won't work. Okay? So, what do you do nowadays? The Arizal said, well, nobody knows what tribe they come from. After all, the 10 lost tribes, and there's a few survivors, and people generally aren't familiar with exactly what their Shorish Haneshama is. I mean, how does somebody know that he's a Yisrael? How does somebody know he's a Levi? You have to admit that. And so what he says is he's going to do a public service, the Arizal, and he's going to do LCD, lowest common denominator. One size fits all. He's going to go Shara Kolel. No, seriously. And then, no matter what it was, you have to understand what you're doing. But if you do that, then indeed, your prayer will get in, period. Which is really great. When the Sephardim hear about this, in the late 1500s, early 1600s, they say, great, we didn't know about this before. And we switch. That's what I say. The Sephardic Siddur today is what they understand to be this common thing called the Nusach Ha'ari. Nobody knows exactly what the Nusach Ha'ari is because he didn't write it. And it's not clear 100% from his disciples, particularly Hanukkah, what precisely it was. But nevertheless, in spite of that, all through the 1600s, and all through the 1700s, and in the Sephardic world, even in the very early 1800s, there are constant attempts to write and rewrite and get it correct. and they really work at it. This is the work of the great Kabbalists of the 16th, 17th, and early 1800s, if people are familiar with that. Now, that's fine. So that means that if you go to a Sephardic synagogue in 1620, they're going to be praying not with radical differences, but with some important differences, differently than they did in 1520, and certainly 1420 and so forth. The Sephardim changed even at the level of davening. By contrast, when this is Ashkenaz, one thing they are not going to change is things like the Siddur. You're not going to tell me, because it's counterintuitive, that your grandfather was Rashi, but since he didn't pray with the right nusach, his prayers didn't get into heaven. How's it named? It's not because he didn't have the nusach already, so it didn't work. God didn't hear his prayer. It's counterintuitive to the traditional Jew. You know, particularly think about if the grandfather, great-grandfather was a Kadosh, he perished at the stake and died for the sake of Judaism, or wrote some famous sefer, and he would tell me, but God didn't hear what he had to say. It doesn't go. And so that's, how do you square that circle? How do you deal with the contradiction, as I said before, between the fact that they didn't say the Arizal was wrong, that never entered into the imagination. But on the other hand, we're not changing, so what do? So historically speaking, what happens in the 16 and early 1700s is that, you know, unconsciously, organically, it just happens that the consensus forms in communities that are here and here, you know, Central Europe and Eastern Europe, what we call the Ashkenazi Jews, that you have to understand the Lurianic material, the Arizal stuff, as referring, as being 100% proper, but reserved for a special elite. They didn't mean for you and me. They meant for people on a very high level, very high madrega, as they would put it. People of that nature, whose lives are lived different than the rest of us, who, let us say, really spend 24/7. One thing, for example, someone like the Vilna Gaon. You know, people of that nature, that stature, that lifestyle, they will understand, as the rest of us do not, how to properly integrate these Kabbalistic ideas into the rest of their practice and their knowledge of the Torah and all the rest of it in such a way that it'll leave a constructive result, rather than if you and I do it and we don't understand any of these things, it'll leave a destructive result. And so that way you can have your cake and eat it. That way you can say that the whole community davens Ashkenaz. There is, in many communities, and more and more, a small group of people who are the Vilna Gaon types, to use the code word. And they pray in a separate synagogue. And they live a different lifestyle, and they really put their money where their mouth is, as we would say. You know, you really see the candles burning all night long, and it's not a fake. And they are really experts in the entire Talmudic literature, and they're also experts, and not phonies, in the Kabbalistic literature. They know what they're doing. They can pray separately. This came to be a phenomenon very much associated with an institution that popped up in the early modern period, all throughout this area over here, all throughout Poland and Central Europe, called the Kleis, which is like a Christian Klaus. And a Kleis was what you and I today would call a super kollel. It's some rich person, usually a lady, interesting. Some rich person would leave an endowment. And the endowment was for 5 people, 10 people, never more than 10, 15 people at most, to sit and learn full-time for 5 years, 10 years, something along those lines. And then they'll go out and become rabbis or dayanim or things of that nature. And it wasn't like today you were expected to literally be in the kollel all week long and sleep there. You would come home for Shabbos. If you want a little bit of an idea of this, you read the Noda B'Yehuda's, who was someone who graduated from one of these classes, his eulogy for his wife, where he says, you don't know what she did, the years that we were first married, you know, she never saw me all week, just on Shabbos, and she was willing to put up with all that, and so on and so forth. It was a very eloquent eulogy. And the point is that these people, as I say before, were expected, because they get a stipend, to, you know, not live a almost monastic sort of life, entirely devoted to Talmudic study and to Kabbalistic studies as well. Okay? Not all of them, but from that group will emerge those who are able to have the knowledge, as the classic Hebrew expression goes, Mali, Kreis, and B'Shas, Poskim, once they've already mastered the normative, exoteric rabbinic literature, to be able to engage intelligently and appropriately with the esoteric. And they would indeed conduct themselves different Shabbos, they wear white clothes, they would daven from a different prayer book, and people understood that because it's a marginal element. This is a group that doesn't apply. They would tell you themselves, don't you come in here. Right? You were supposed, we tell everybody else, you should do the regular way. And that way, you had an institution which was outside of the consensus, but at the very same time was part of the consensus, because by declaring itself to be a marginal element, it reinforced the appropriateness of normative practice for the mass of Jews. So it was appropriate, and the idea therefore was that the study of Kabbalah, you and I, most people you meet today, are the heirs of this tradition. Everybody believes, or most people believe, in one way or another, in the Kabbalistic tradition. But on the other hand, they don't study in yeshivas. You don't see people, except a few, engaging in this in any kind of serious way. The idea is Kabbalah is there, but it's not for me. It's not for you. It's for him. Who's in? I don't know, but it's for him. It's for someone else. And that attitude is what you call the normative Ashkenazic Jewish traditionalist attitude that spread all across the kingdom of Poland and Central Europe and Holy Roman Empire, particularly Bohemia and other areas like that. Now, the problem is that this person arose in the early 1700s named the Baal Shem Tov, and he challenged that. See? He said that Kabbalistic practice, Loranic ideas, even systems of prayer and others, are not meant for a tiny elite, as opposed to the mass. He said it's not for everybody. Understand? He said you shouldn't change the prayer book. You should change the customs. If it's true, then it's true. This provoked, as you can understand by what I'm describing to you tonight and last time, a very violent psychological reaction on the part of the masses, or a section of the masses. Because he's challenging long-held ideas. So I'm trying to present Hasidus tonight in an externalist fashion, but for the purpose of historical analysis. And this is really why it was that you had these very violent clashes between what you and I will call as a code word, although this radically simplifies it, the Vilna Gaon versus the Baal Shem Tov. You know, when I use that phrase, people know what I'm talking about, even though it's an oversimplification. But the main people who were the Misnagdim, when Hasidus began to arise, were the members of the Kloises. The people who signed the original ban, Kheres on Hasidism in 1772, are the leaders of the two leading Kloises in Poland, the two leading centers of Kabbalistic study and practice. The Klois in Brody on the one hand, which was in one end of Poland over there, that's where Brody is, and on the other hand, the Klois in Vilna. At the other hand, you and I know that the leader of the Klois in Vilna is somebody called the Vilna Gaon. That's what he was. He didn't daven in the regular shul, he didn't have to do with the other people, he had his own special little group over there, and that's what they were into, in their particular way. And this is the reason, as they say before, that traditionalism now, in an unexpected fashion, gets attacked from the right. Because the legitimacy of so many of the practices of the traditional Ashkenazic Jewry, which had evolved over so many centuries, as I say, crystallized in the 15 and 1600s, and was really crystallized and hardened by the 1700s, now comes a direct attack, because one thing about Kabbalah is that it moves everything to the right. Everything about Kabbalah is more machmir in practice, in mitzvahs, in halacha. It had to be this way. When the Zohar comes out of the closet, which is what it says, that's what it said, they're coming out of, and they said they're doing it, they use those words, right? Because they were challenged. The Talmudic tradition is, this is stuff you don't take out of the closet. You don't publish this in the book. You keep this within a very restricted circle. So they gave reasons why they did it. This is not that's for another course. I have to talk to the associate about that. See? But when they do that, so they were, as I say before, setting up a new set of authority and practices. And how could that work in the medieval Jewry and early modern Jewry, which was totally committed to the supremacy and the unchallenged and absolute supremacy of the Talmud Bavli, of the Talmud? And the answer is it can work because it's always more machmir. You understand? If you ever had a situation in which you never do, if you ever had a situation in which the Talmud Bavli, the Gemara as we call it, says something is a treif, and the Zohar or some similar kind of Kabbalistic source would say it's kosher, you would have a short circuit. In other words, it would not have been accepted and would cause a big crisis and it would have caused a major crisis, and it would have prevented any of this from getting in. Because nothing can challenge the Gemara. But it's never like that. It's the other way around. The Gemara says it's kosher, and the Zohar will say it's treif, or the Rizal or something. Well, you don't do anything wrong by not eating it. You know what I'm saying? The Gemara may indicate that such a practice is permitted on Shabbos. Or the Talmudic commentators, like Tosfos, many times they'll say, now times by refraining from doing it. And so all practice, all of Zohar, all of Kabbalah moves everything in a frummer direction, if I can use that word, in a right-wing direction. That's very interesting, its impact on the Maimonidean controversies, by the way, of the 1200s. Because there the question was, how far to the left can Judaism go? And what emerges is a movement which nukes the opposition and renders all the issues of philosophical debate, which is not for today, moot, and replace it with an entirely new discourse. And I can tell you right now, from the time the Kabbalah begins to emerge in the late 1200s, and it doesn't happen overnight because it's not television and books and like we have today and instant communications, things take a couple generations. Within 150 years, the movement of Jewish medieval philosophy is killed. The last Jewish medieval philosophy book was published in 1410, the Sefer Ekra. And nobody's interested in after it. You know what I'm saying? Jews aren't interested in the kind of questions that evoke passionate responses from people like the Rambam, from Yehuda Levi, from Chazai Kreskes, from Sadi Gaon. It's an episode in Jewish history, the medieval Jewish philosophy. It came and it went. And it was destroyed, so to speak, by, or better yet, replaced by the Kabbalah, which, as I said, I can't go into great detail now, obviously, makes all the questions of philosophy irrelevant. Either you buy into it or you don't. But I'm telling you that the Jews all did. And therefore, issues of metaphysics and Aristotelianism become of no interest to Jews. It's quite a remarkable phenomenon. So everything moves to the right and becomes more religious, if I can use that term. But that's going to be the big fight in Poland in the 1700s. That's going to be a fight over tradition. What do you mean you're more religious than us? You telling me you're more religious than your father? What, are you nuts? You're more religious than your grandmother? Who do you think you are? That very notion of saying I'm more to the right, very offensive. Very offensive to traditionalist Ashkenaz Jews. These people become what we call the Misnagdim, who dominate in the central part of Europe over there, in the Holy Roman Empire on the one hand, people like the Noda Yehuda, for example, and form a very strong presence in the Kingdom of Poland. I don't say they dominated, it was a big fight. It raged all through the 1700s. And if it was up to them, they would suppress Hasidism, declare it some kind of heresy and paganism, because that's what they held it was, and they were excommunicated. As we know, although they tried to do all that, it was completely unsuccessful. They completely defeated that effort. Because the masses didn't see it that way. They voted with their feet. But you understand the reasons for the objections to it. You understand the passionate response that it evoked, because it suggests, as I said before, what, you're more religious now? For example, the Baal Shem Tov had a campaign to fix the shechita knives. They're not sufficiently sharp. Oh, really? So your grandfather ate treif, right? Your grandfather was the Shvush Yanko, the Ramah, Rashi. Oh, they ate treif. And you, the Ganza Kanak over here, now you're kosher. You follow? Now, what's really interesting, all this is true. What's really interesting to me at the moment is that the Hasidim themselves never accepted that definition of themselves. That was like the secret to their success. They didn't fight back exactly in a regular way, but it's clear that Hasidism defined itself not as the other side was saying, a alternative to traditionalism, but they defined themselves as a new and improved version of traditionalism. A new and improved version of traditionalism. They said there's nothing wrong with being more strict. We're not saying anything about the people before, but there's nothing wrong with being strict. And the Misnagdim said, of course you're saying something about the people before. So how can you deny that? And over these issues, families split, people got divorced, got in violent fights and all that, all across the Kingdom of Poland. And you can understand, as I said before, that the establishment, very often, the rabbinical establishment of the mystics, of the rabbis, of the dayanim, of people like that, looked on this with horror. So it's not so much as you read about sometimes in history book, they saw it's another Shabtai Tzvi, so it's not really true. I think that was pretty clear. early on in the Hasidic movement. But the very nature of trying to, as they see it, undermine the existing structure with something new and improved was powerfully offensive. Okay? Was powerfully offensive. And therefore you have this very interesting phenomenon. People like the only going on is who give you the right to implement these chumras. Now, some may remember that in the Gemara they speak in places about people who introduce new chumras that we suspect them of heresy. For example, it says in the Mishnah, if someone says, I'm only going to daven in white, don't let for the Amud. Don't let him daven at all. There's no sin in davening in white. Why do you want to daven in white? What's wrong with everybody else? You're introducing something new. Where does this come from? You can understand these kinds of notions. So, Hasidism in its very nature, leaving aside its internal doctrines, but as a new movement, attacked traditionalism from the right. The Hasidim, as I said before, are very careful always to deny it, and they deny it till today. Okay? They see themselves as the heirs and the successors, and possibly, very probably, I wouldn't doubt it, they see themselves as the only holdouts of traditionalism. Everybody else has changed, certainly in dress and many other ways. We are still holding out. If you ask them, why did you change the siddur? Why do you change this custom and that custom? That's not so easy to answer. But they, in spite of that, they preserved, their claim, which was very attractive to the masses, of being an integral part of the traditionalism. And I might, before I leave this subject, I might give you one very interesting example. All across Poland, as we'll see, I don't know about tonight, but we will see here before I'm done, Hasidus was victorious. By the time we get to the middle 1800s, the majority of the Jews in Poland probably, it's the largest Jewish community in the world, converted to Hasidism in one form or another. Yes, they did. And they took over, as it were, many, many towns and cities with very famous traditions. Ostrow, where the Marshal was, and Krakow, where the Ramah was, and Lublin, where the Marshal used to be, and so on and so forth. It's very interesting to note that if you would come to these towns, let's say 100 years ago, in the year 1907, was very, very, very heavily Hasidic, sometimes entirely Hasidic. Everywhere you had steeples and so on and so forth, which were davening various forms of the Hasidic siddur, not the main shul. The Hasidim themselves kept the Nusach Ashkenaz in the Ramah shul in Krakow, in the Marshal shul in Ostrow, and similar places, because that is part of traditionalism. You understand? And if that was the shul where the Ramah daven, he daven from this way. So even Hasidim, when they go and daven in that shul, will still keep the old way. And people then look at this as inconsistent. They look at it. If they're Cheres, right? And Hasidus plays very heavy emphasis on ideas such as derech eretz. And that enabled them, among other things, to win. Because that's what happened, they won. And the Hasidic movement, therefore, as I say before, in its essence, represents a challenge to traditionalism in its willingness, and its more than willingness, and its goal to change so much of Jewish life, but it's always to the right. And also in the particular forms of organization that it involved, and I will tonight only address two. First of all, as I said before, there never was such thing as a Hasidic Rebbe. Believe me, the Rambam would have loved to have the type of power of a Hasidic Rebbe. I'm not being funny when I say it. Rabbis down the ages, not Marshall, of course, have always been struggling with Balabata. Right? You're always telling people you're doing this wrong, you're doing that wrong. That's what a rabbi gets paid for, right? You have to read the sermons down the centuries of the greatest, of Yonas and Aishas, and then of Yehuda, of the Ramah, down the centuries. In Spain, in Poland, in Germany, it's the same theme over and over again. Which you're all backsliding, you have to change, this is wrong on Pesach, this is wrong on Shabbos, too much talking, this, that, and the other. It really is. I mean, you don't know because unless you haven't read the literature, but it's all there. So it means that the Rabbanim are saying do this and do that, the Dayanim are saying do this and do that, and people aren't doing it. And as I said before, this goes back to Moshe Rabbeinu. This is part of traditionalism. Understand? Part of traditionalism means that you go, no. It means the community accepts the fact that they're not necessarily doing everything right. Everybody's striving. We all stumble here and there. Hopefully, things get better. If it's before Yom Noraim, in every community, things got a little more religious. After Yom Noraim, things got a little bit less religious. There were cycles to this over the years, and that's what a Shabbos. They go to Rosh Hashanah in the classic sense, a Shabbos Shuvah, Rosh Hashanah, and things of this nature. The idea that the rabbi says to do this and everybody does it is not ancient. It's not medieval, it's not early modern. It started in the 1700s, which means that the Hasidim, by definition, had to replace the existing principle of organization, the Kehillah, with something else. That's a radical change in Jewish history. Official organizations in Poland and Central Europe, well, let's talk about Poland, where the Hasidim went out. The official organizations are the Kehillos. There's a appointed body, as I said before. It's legally recognized by the state. It has a board of directors. It has something called a rabbi or a communal rabbi or a chief rabbi. It has a certain kind of a beis din. It has certain forms and structures. There are committees. There's ways of raising taxes. There are always fights in every community how to apportion the taxes, obviously. The rich people want to apportion it one way, obviously, and the poor people want to apportion it a different way. That goes without saying. And there's all kind of, internal dynamics and tensions. That is the way it was in Italy, in Spain, in Greece, in Egypt, you name it. Okay? And every Jew residing in that area was required by law to be a member of that community. You can't opt out unless you have extremely high protectia. If you are really, really tight, and this happens very rarely, but the king of Poland or Prince Poniatowski or something like that, you may get a special charter which says you don't have to listen to the rules of the Jewish community. That's the thing. But most of the time, for 99%, if you live in Brody, you are a member there whether you like it or not. And you're going to pay taxes there whether you like it or not. And if you open your store on Shabbos, something like that, we're going to punish you one way or another, either financially or physically or some other way. I told you, the essence of the Kehillah is coercion. Otherwise, it's a club. In America, the Kehillahs are clubs. You want to join, you join. You don't want to join, you don't join. I like this shul, this more I like that shul. Somebody wants to keep Shabbos, a few years later decide they don't want to keep. Nobody can make you do anything. It's a free country. That's freedom of religion. You feel like joining, you join. You don't feel like joining, you don't. It's voluntary. These things were not voluntary. That's their whole metzius, as we say. Their whole existence was that, just like in ancient times, a person couldn't say in the time of David Melch, I feel like belonging to Jewish people, I don't feel like joining people. They'll draft you. They'll make you do things. You're part of a country. Same thing if you're in Krakow. Same thing if you're in Vilna. Same thing if you're in Frankfurt or in Metz or any of these other places, or in Rome or in Constantinople. And so that was a formal institutional authority. Hasidism offers an alternative to that, an informal authority. You're never legally required to belong to a Hasidic group. You pick it. You choose it. And especially, by the way, until the middle 1800s, actually to the late 1800s, it's very common, different Hasidim would switch. Sometimes you like the Yankees, sometimes you like the Orioles, sometimes you like the group. No. This was its strength. You understand? If you're a follower of this type of Rebbe, there are many, many stories in which, at a certain point, the Rebbe would tell the person, this is not working out. I'm not the person for you. You have a ticket in the show. Go to that one. They would have, sometimes Rebbe, turf wars, obviously, but broadly speaking, they would say, you should find the group that is appropriate to you. And that's something new. That's entirely voluntary. They're replacing the Kehillah with something different. And Hasidus does that. It doesn't displace the Kehillos, because it's too traditionalistic for that. They don't say, let us take over and dismantle the Kehillah of Vilna or Krakow or Brody or any of those places. They say, that should keep on going, because that's part of Yiddishkeit. That's part of the way Jews have been practicing Judaism since before Avram Avinu, as they saw it. But in addition to that, or in a more real way, my real allegiance is not to these 5 or 10 rich guys who run the community and unfortunately can boss everybody else around when it comes to taxes and tell them what to do. My real allegiance is to the Lubavitch Rebbe who lives over there, to the Satmar Rebbe who lives over there, or to a Noam Elimelech who lives in another place who comes around once in a while. That's the real allegiance. And so it really challenged traditionalism in traditionalism's most important political aspect, which was its claim of exclusive power for all the Kehillos. I can't emphasize this too much. Part of being a religious Jew was belonging. You liked this once upon a time, right? You belonging to what I refer to as a coercive Kehillah, which is bound. This is your little piece of the kingdom of Israel, and you have to work within the system. And now Hasidism says, no, we have an alternative. You can sort of opt out of the system. Not really in the sense of resigning from the community, but you can, in your heart and mind, and where it really counts, attain a new set of allegiances. And I might say that Hasidism never moved to replace any of the Kehillahs down to the Holocaust. They just tried to take them over. And they very often succeeded. And so you would very, very often, by the time you get to the late 800, even the late 1700s. You can find many, many towns in Poland, and particularly in Ukraine, we had such a large Jewish population, almost all of whom became Hasidim. They were filled out later, but almost all the Ukraine was Hasidic in one dynasty or another. And you would find town after town where you'll see there's a Rov, and there's a Kehillah, and there's a cemetery run by the Kehillah, and a shul, and a mikvah, and all the board of directors, all the rest of it. And how are they chosen? Well, in the old way, there's elections once a year in Chol Moed Pesach, Chol Moed Sukkos, like it's always been. But in reality, the Hornstein Rebbe's calling the shots. Voluntarily, right? Have the elections and all the rest of it, but that's what happens. And of course, it gets really interesting when you have a town where not everybody's a follower of the Hornstein Rebbe, You could have a town where some are Lubavitch, some are Ger, some are this, and then after you have the turf wars at election time. And what they'll end up doing is the Israeli politics that we're so familiar with today, because they've taken all this and transferred it to the state of Israel. What are you laughing at? They have. Right? I'm talking about, for example, the Aguda or things like this. How many seats do you get? 4 or 5 seats. Who gets this Knesset seat? Who gets this Knesset seat? Who gets the money apportioned? It's the old system. You understand? So and so much goes for this group. And they work it out like in a certain type of tammany hall, but that's what they do. And it works for them. The point is that this represented a profound challenge to traditionalism, as I said before, from an unexpected source, one might say, which is from the right. That it challenged traditionalism as being insufficiently religious, insufficiently spiritual. After all, what is Hasidism's main message? They offer genuine spirituality. So what kind of a critique is that? You aren't. The Kehillas and the Rabbanim and all the rest, you aren't. That's a major attack. But it doesn't ever present itself as an attack. It always presents itself as part of the system, an improved version of the Ford. Okay? Now, keep that in mind as that happens, as I said before, all through the 1700s. So Baal Shem Tov was born in 1790. He became, 1690, excuse me, became a Hasidic leader somewhere in the 1720s or 30s. Nobody knows exactly. And he died in 1760. So this starts in an early stage, obviously, to be a phenomenon that happens in the first half of the 1700s. As I'm sure we all know, it just got bigger and bigger. So by the time after his death, it grew leaps and bounds, and after the death of his successor, it grew even greater leaps and bounds. So the public liked it. That's the bottom line. It's a voluntary, democratic, if I can use that word, phenomenon in which masses and masses of Jews, I don't know if it was 50%, 60%, a huge percent, we'll never know the numbers, a huge percent of the Jews of the Kingdom of Poland, which includes on the left the whole big area of the Ukraine, and Volhynia and Podolia, these areas, Galicia over here, and eventually in Congress, Poland over here, and even in White Russia, that's where you have groups like Chabad and the other Hasidic groups that oppose Chabad, like the, what's it called, the Lachovich and the other dynasties. And even in Lithuania itself, as we know, that's where the big fights were with the Vilna Gaon and people like that. It's spread everywhere. So notice, people said, this is an improved version of traditionalism. This is not something new and radical. It just, granted it's different, but we're all going to agree to have a certain cognitive dissonance in regard to this. And we're going to all say that we're exactly like our ancestors were, we're exactly like our great-great-grandparents were. Yeah, they died a little bit different than us, they did this a little different than us. We're going to not emphasize it, we're going to paper that over. And it is a strategy that worked. An intellectual can stand there and say, but, you're different in this, that, and the other. I'm telling you, as a matter of social history, that's not an argument that had resonance in Poland, in Polish Jews, and eventually in Hungary, because in the early 1800s, Hasidism will spill over into Hungary, especially Eastern Hungary. That's the only other country it went into before the Holocaust. You see? There were no Hasidim in America, in England, places like that. Nothing to speak about. Until Hitler, Hasidism remained here in the Kingdom of Poland, which the borders changed, of course, with the Russian Empire and things of this nature, in Poland and Hungary. It didn't get into here or there or any of these other places. Very tiny groups in Eretz Israel, and that's what it was. We're living now in the post-war world that Hasidism has been compelled by a force of events to relocate itself. So today it's primarily, of course, in North America and Israel, primarily. So that's, a separate schmooze, as they say. But nevertheless, you see, I hope what I mean when I say that traditionalism is hammered from the right. Now, on the other hand, at the same time, with a slight time differentiation, traditionalism began to be hammered from the left, but not in Poland at all. And Poland remained supreme throughout the 1700s, supreme. As I say, the fight is over how strict you want to be. In the German states, however, things were different, because the Jews had been expelled from Germany by 1500 or so. They all went to Poland. There were very, very tiny numbers of Jews over here, if you're talking about the 1500s. However, then in the 1600s came something called the 30 Years' War. If you remember it from high school and places like that, where the Catholics and the Protestants went at each other. And the Catholics very successfully shafted the Protestants, and the Protestants very successfully shafted the Catholics. And so, I mean it. So by the time the 30 years were over, there were entire regions of Germany that were depopulated. The Catholic Church even gave a 10-year heter to take 2 wives. That when they finally settled the war with a stalemate, the war didn't change anything. The Catholic areas remained Catholic, and the Protestant areas remained Protestant. And by the way, the Jews were not touched at all during the war. They were so busy killing each other, they left the Jews alone, which is interesting. But by the time the war was over, Germany had broken into, you can sort of tell in this map, a whole bunch of little states. It's not a perfect map in that regard, but you can see, obviously there's the Austrian territories, there's Saxony and Bavaria, and the Prussian state. This is in 1713, right after the Treaty of Utrecht. It got more complex. This map doesn't do it justice. It got more and more complex. I think 337 states, if I remember correctly, in Germany. Obviously, some were big and some were the size of a postage stamp. Right? I'll give you an example. Frankfurt was a separate country. Hamburg was a separate country, once upon a time. They had such things. The bishopric of Onnesbroek, was a separate country. So this is the Holy Roman Empire. The Jews start to move back legally and illegally after the 1648. The economy was so devastated that individual German princes were willing to break the rules, like George Bush is willing to break the rules today as far as the Hispanic immigration. It's the exact same thing. It's a don't ask, don't tell. Sometimes they say we can bring in a couple Sephardic Jews because they're different, they look more noble. But inevitably, after the Sephardic Jews come the riffraff, the Ashkenazim. And that's how they saw it. That is what happened, and there are books about this. And the Jews do re-enter Germany, starting in 1648, 1649, and continued to settle there all into the 1700s. They came now in a new environment. Germany was trying to recover, and they did to some extent, recover from the 30 Years' War, and they had many other wars in the course of the 16 and 1700s. If you know your European history, there was a guy named Louis XIV, the King of France, who kept the wars going all the time. And the result is that the Jews here found themselves in a new but very difficult economic environment, and a new one. To move to Berlin, to move to Hamburg, to move even to Metz and places like that in Germany meant it's not the same thing, of course, but like moving to New York. The Russian Jews moved to a brand new environment. And what do we know about the American Jews when they moved to New York and Baltimore, a place like that? Economics made people work on Shabbos. So in the 1700s, they put a big strain, we know this from the Shabbos and Chuvas others, on not working on Shabbos or keeping kosher 100%, or more importantly, now it wasn't the same thing as happened in New York, because this is still the 1600s. This is still the 1700s. Even so, we find in the German states a de-emphasis on chinuch, but use the traditional word. People say like this, yeah, all that learning is great, but hey, you got to get out there. You're already 12 years old, time to go work. And more importantly, what kind of educational skills can I give you that will help you in your business? And so a lot of it has to do with learning foreign languages, because you look at the map of Europe and you see, if you want to do business, you have to know a lot of different languages, particularly French and English and German and things like that, because every 10 minutes is another country. Is it true or not? And indeed, if you know Italian, you'll be able to conduct a business that way. If you know English, you'll be able to conduct a business that way. And then we find a de-emphasis in German Jewry, even while the parents are still, so to speak, traditional. They're basically Shomer Shabbat. They're going to shul. Even the children are going to shul. But subtle changes are happening because it's not Poland anymore. It's not that constant reinforcement at the local level that you once upon a time had when you lived in small communities in Poland. When you live in Germany, you don't live in a small community necessarily. Frankfurt is a city. Hamburg is a city. Berlin obviously is a city. And you're surrounded by an effervescent European culture. It's the 1700s already. It's the age of the Enlightenment. It's the age of Baroque and Rococo. And things are happening in Europe. And it's exciting. And that's not so great if you're a traditionalist and trying to raise your kid in a culturally insulated environment, like you were able to do without any difficulty whatsoever if you still remained in the Kingdom of Poland. But Parnos, you got to move to new places, and what do you do about that? And so we see a weakening of the fabric. We see a weakening of the fabric as we go 1710, 20, 30, 40, 50, and all the rest of it. Of all the Ashkenazic Jewry was, a voluntary, strong cultural insularity, which meant that not only in the Middle Ages, when all of European culture was Christian, did the Jews exhibit no interest in what's going on in European culture, but even when that began to change in the 14 and 1500s, and you get the Renaissance, and the Age of Reason, and the discoveries of science, and the development of secularity, an increasingly large secular component in culture. And you get, in the 18th century, to the Enlightenment, as they call it, when really new ideas are getting there. The Ashkenazi Jews still are at least officially committed, and in reality, usually we're committed to these notions of not paying attention to what's going on around them. For them, it's still the 1000s, you see? Now, that was going to crack sooner or later, because the outside reality is different. And it lasted, the fact that it lasted so long is a testimony to the strength of the fabric of the traditionalism in which Jews were once raised. Just to use one word will indicate the strength of the fabric of this traditionalism. Women. There's no chinuch. There's no schooling for females. That's a key element of the traditionalist Jewish society. You're just supposed to pick it up mimetically, what goes on around you. Why did women start to be interested in the Renaissance and the Age of Reason and who knows what? They weren't. Not till you get to the 1700s is there even the slightest crack. It shows you how strong the fabric of community was. That, you're Atlanta born, Atlanta bred, and when you die, Atlanta dead. You're going to stay all the way through with the community. And this was once upon a time, it's weakening in the 1700s, and that's why it's happening sooner or later. Not too surprising that we'll find, starting in the 1750s and 60s, phenomenon of somebody like Moses Mendelssohn in Berlin, who is a mythical figure, usually in the history books. They'll say like this: Moses Mendelssohn started Reform Judaism, he started Gospel, he made everybody not from all that. None of that is exactly true. Nevertheless, if we look at the history as opposed to the myth, it's very revealing, I argue. And that is, let's talk about this person for a minute, because obviously it's going to be a seminal figure in what develops into a hammering of traditionalism from the left. Okay? And Mendelssohn was born near Berlin in East Germany, in Brandenburg in Prussia, in Dessau, and from a very his father was a cipher, came from a very, as we would say, to a very frum family, and never got an English education, never got a secular education. He was sent as a young boy to Berlin. Not to go. There was no university in Berlin in the 1700s. He went to Berlin because that's where the yeshiva was. You see? Berlin, even though it's the headquarters of the modern state of Prussia, even though it's under Frederick the Great, who is a ruthless anti-Semite, an absolutely ruthless anti-Semite. He has those good old laws where only one member of the family is allowed to get married, unless you pay, $50,000 fine and so forth. And that's just one of many, many, many of his thoughtful gezeros. But there is a Jewish community there, which means there's a kehillah with a board of directors, and one synagogue, and a cemetery, and a yeshiva, base medrash as they call it, run by the chief rabbi, because the guy they hired as the chief rabbi, as I tried to explain last week, you get somebody as Rav, his main job in the good old days was not to give sermons and not to visit the hospital and perform clergy duties and things of this nature, or God forbid to give sermons, but to spend his time interacting with Talmidim. The David Frankel, he wrote a commentary on the Yerushalmi, it's fairly well known, and I think the Carbonata it's called. And so here's this little boy, Mendelssohn, he comes in there, and he spent, I think, 10, maybe 15 years, think about this, a long time in yeshiva there, with no secular studies whatsoever. He never did. The only thing is, he's one of these yeshiva boys, and you always have them there at nighttime, after he went to the morning Seder and the afternoon Seder and the night Seder, he was interested in reading books. And so in the dorm room, as we would say today, by candlelight, he develops an interest and somehow or other gets someone to teach him how to read. And when you read one language, you can then work your way through the other languages. Completely autodidactic, completely self-taught. And I'll say again, to the Rosh Yeshiva, what do you care? Is he there for davening every day? Is he there for a Seder and all that every day? Is he, is he Shomer Torah mitzvahs 100%? Is he Ma'amin, as we would say, for 100%? So there's always some guys. There's certain weirdos in every yeshiva like history. There's certain weirdos in every yeshiva. There's certain weirdos in every yeshiva that will like philosophy or God help us, geometry or things like that. You'll find it. And in textiles, in the course of that's what he stayed his whole life. He had a job, 9 to 5. And his whole life, he rose, till eventually he became a partner. A typical middle-class capitalist, upwardly mobile situation. Never became a rich man. He never was poor. And went to shul. He had a Seder. In fact, one of the people he had a Seder with was the grandfather of St. Rachel Hirsch. Right? And his name was Moses Mendelssohn Frankfurter. He was the Shomer Torah mitzvahs, we'd say. I remember once I read his wife wouldn't wear a shekel. Why was his wife wearing a shekel? She was too frum for that. Once upon a time, wearing a shekel was an extreme left-wing phenomenon. And if you look at the classic poskim, they were very opposed to shekels. That's her tickle. She wore a bonnet like Martha Washington. There are pictures of it. So he's not exactly what you call a radical. On the other hand, he wasn't interested in history, but very interested in philosophy. That's just something that turned him on. And he mastered, he read a lot. And he mastered the current and previous elements of European philosophy. I'm not talking about only Greek philosophy from the past, but what was going on in the intellectual ferment of the Enlightenment. He was into the philosophy of somebody named Leibniz, and who was a German philosopher. He was very firm Christian. Understand? He's not a radical. He was into the very traditionalistic side of philosophy. But all it meant was, he's a little bit strange. On Tuesday nights and Thursday nights, he somehow or other made friends with a couple of other people in Berlin who were not Jewish, who were also interested in a similar phenomenon. And they got together in a bar, two nights a week to talk matters of common interest. They are very interested to see somebody Jewish like that. He's like a talking monkey. They're not used to this. That's what they said. That's what they said. And they encouraged him, you should write your ideas down. He said, nah, right. No, on the contrary, we see a talent and all the rest of it. And eventually encouraged him to publish in a newspaper. It like freaks him out why he got actually published in a newspaper. And after a while, years has gone by, actually a book on a matter called Phaedon, which is taken from Plato. It's a question about the immortality of the soul. It's Plato's dialogue. When Socrates is dying, he wants to know what will happen after death. It doesn't matter, And there's this whole discussion. So he wrote his own version of it. He just called it by that title, and he makes the case that there is immortality of the soul. It's unthinkable that when you die, it's all over. So it's nothing objectionable from a Jewish. This is a book written in German. It wasn't written for a Jewish audience at all. And he had modest expectations of it. Number 1 on the New York Times bestseller list. That's what happened. He was shocked. Everybody was shocked. It hit number 1. Apparently it touched the courting Christians. He got fan mail from princes and dukes, from priests in monasteries in the Tyrol, who said, we had religious doubts, and after you read your book, it was like fresh water. We can't believe it. You're an unbelievable person. He wears tefillin, And it was absolutely amazing. And for the first time ever, a Shomer Shabbos, to use the word that we're familiar with, a Shomer Shabbos Jew, all of a sudden became a player in the news, in European culture, even in the matters of highest philosophy. And he's not a Jew converted to Christianity, which would be different. He's a Jewish Jew. And really became part of the travel guides they have from the 1700s. When you visit Berlin, you have to go see Potsdam Palace, you have to see Frederick the Great's Guards, you have to go to this and this place where there's a Jew who can read and write. And then Mendelssohn, and I'm telling you, he had princes and dukes and all kinds of people came to see him, and it was just an unbelievable phenomenon. How did the Jewish community react to that? He's a frum guy, as they say today. He's a Shomer Shai, not bothering anybody. As a matter of fact, this is good. Now we have a member of the community who has an in with the non-Jews. So if we ever have some situation of intercede with the government or something like that, that's the guy to go to, because we can't write German anyway very well, can't express ourselves. This is the guy who'll have validation and so forth. And that's what happened. Not long after this, a few years later, a Protestant minister from Switzerland wrote him a public letter, and he said like this, we're all wondering, how can it be that a guy like you, obviously is intelligent, is a Jew? It doesn't make any sense. He was Masiach Lefi Tumas. He wasn't trying to be funny. That's the way it was. His name was Johann Christian Lavater. He said, how can it be that, obviously anybody who's intelligent must see the truth of Christianity, the latest trends of thought and philosophy. Why are you doing all? Is it that you're afraid? Are you afraid what your co-religionists will do to you? Are you under some kind of compunction? I call upon you to free yourself of these external, problems and come and do what you must, in your heart of hearts, know to be the right thing. This is very disturbing to him. He wasn't a fighter. Like I said, he's a guy who had Tuesday and Thursday night club. This wasn't the type of person he was in altogether. It gave him a lot of headaches and problems, and he wrote a very famous letter back in a public letter in newspapers, in which, without going, I won't exactly say what he said, but in paraphrase, he basically said like this: believe it or not, I am normal and I'm Jewish. And if you think that Judaism is very irrational, all the rest of it, he didn't use these words, but what it boils down to is, which of the two religions is more irrational? In simple terms, if you're Jewish, you got to believe in the Old Testament. If you're Christian, you got to believe in the Old Testament plus the New Testament. The Immaculate Conception, the Virgin Birth, the Resurrection, the transubstantiation, that the matzah becomes the body, and all this stuff. Do you really want to go there? But he said it in a very extreme, he didn't say the words I used. He said it in an extremely diplomatic fashion. And the guy backed off. He said, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hurt you. I thought I'm helping you, whatever, And so he had a nervous breakdown as a result of this. There was too much restraint. And as a result of this, he said, I'm not so interested anymore in being a player in European culture. It's hard to get along with these Christians, So he didn't give it up at all, but now he transferred his interest more to the Jewish community, which begins to cause some trouble. Because, in point of fact, when he was directing all of his efforts in the European cultural scene, that meant that he was living a bifurcated life, in which this is what he does as a Jew, and this is what he does as a European intellectual. Now, he didn't feel comfortable with doing his intellectuality in Europe. And so he transferred his intellectuality into one zone in which he felt comfortable with a degree, and that was Judaism. So now we have someone who's an 18th century intellectual, who's a genuine member of the European Enlightenment movement, of the German Enlightenment movement, who was very conservative religiously. Right? He believes in let's be very clear about this. All of his life he believed in the Torah Sinai, he believes in God, he believes in the Torah mitzvahs, all that sort of thing. But on the other, yes, he did. On the other hand, he has problems with the way Judaism is done. You might say it's because of the books he read, all the rest. Be that as it may, he has problems with it, and he engages in a intellectual, in a number of things. And tonight I only have time for two, and then I'll close. I know I'm a little bit over time. He says he engages in a series of enterprises which has the effect of mounting an attack on two pillars of traditionalism: the cultural insularity on the one hand, and the coercive kehillas on the other. As I'm sure many know, one of the things Mendelssohn gets involved with is the translation of the Bible into German, which he pulled off. There was a major project he did with a number of collaborators. And it was in German, all in Hebrew letters. If you see the Mendelssohn Chumash, it's all in Hebrew. So the German, Bereshis, and then the other side is in Anfang, in Aleph Yud Nun, Anfang, it's all in Hebrew. And so he said that it's necessary to have an art scroll translation, otherwise everybody's going to use the existing translation of German of the Bible, which is Luther. Right? Martin Luther very famously, in the 1500s, wrote a very good, of a certain type, translation of the Bible. Many do. Nobody who references it. It's amazing. Jews used it. He said, this is outrageous. We have to have our own. And he executed a translation of the Chumash, and he had his own commentary on it, which is, not an unfrom commentary, just very modern. he uses very heavily Ibn Ezra, the Ralbag, people like that. But they're all based on based on traditionalist comments. If you see a copy of the Mendelssohn Chumash, you see it's it's very traditional. It's the Chumash, Onkelos, Rashi, and then on the other side upstairs is the German translation, and then his commentary. It looks very much like many Mefarshim that we're used to, and this started to get the rabbis and others saying like this: why are you doing this? You say you want to provide an alternative translation in German. For who? For who? We're not interested in a German translation of the Bible, and certainly not a high German, intellectual German translation of the Bible. But, what is your real agenda? They don't trust it. Is it an agenda that you'll understand the Hebrew better, or is your agenda that you're going to use the Hebrew in order to learn German? Do people really not know what the word Bereshit bara Elokim es hashamayim v'haaretz means? That you need a translation of it? Do they really not understand what it means by Vayetze Yaakov meBe'er Sheva v'Yelech Haran? Or are you trying to teach them how to say that in German? And of course, that was true. And so, what Mendelssohn does is the first great enterprise in mounting an assault to crack the cultural insularity and to say the Jews should learn German. This will enable them to have a more expansive life, an expansive intellectual life. And he did succeed, because when you do something and you print it, even if everybody criticizes and bans it, it gets out there. And that certainly is what happened. Now I'll say it again, the translation itself, the commentaries are not even objectionable. Somebody, a number of years, I saw somewhere an article that many, many, many years later, in the 1800s, one of the people that purchased the Mendelssohn Chumash was Rabbi Akiva Eiger. You see? But by that time, German Jew was much different than it was in the time I'm speaking about. So it wasn't that the content was there, it's the attack on the cultural insularity. It's saying that the way it's been done until now is faulty. A second part of the traditionalism that he attacks is the very narrow definition of Jewish culture. As we've seen now in traditionalism, it's Gemara, 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 Gemara. Yeshivas are still like this today. It's Gemara, 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 Gemara. Tanakh is for the weirdos, history is for the weirdos, philosophy is for major weirdos. Right? These are things that are not done. That's the old way of looking at it. And he, by being interested in language, in philosophy, he is, believe it or not, he didn't like the Rambam. He liked Yehuda Halevi. He wasn't into the Morning Book, many people don't know. He was into the Kuzari. But the idea of writing about and discussing medieval Jewish philosophy, diktuk, similar cognate disciplines, means that he and people like him are making the argument that the definition of Jewish culture should be expanded. These two features, the attack on cultural insularity on the one hand, and the expanded definition of the core of Jewish culture, are the hallmarks of what later on will be called, what in his time already began to be called the Haskalah movement. It doesn't necessarily mean that someone's a Machal Shabbos. Many developed into that. Many did not. Many did not. And so what you and I call the Haskalah movement has to be understood as a spectrum. And there's an extreme right and extreme left, as always. But on the other hand, it's a new day. It's a major change. And it's a hammering of traditionalism in its core values, not in its incidental values. And finally, Mendelssohn got involved in what you and I would call civil rights or emancipation. This was not really in the cards in the 1700s. The European states, I think I mentioned last week, define themselves as Christian states, Christian commonwealths. If it does, then a Jew by definition can have no civil rights. So the only thing you can appeal for is an amelioration of the gezeros that are already there. In 1778 and 1779, Mendelssohn was appealed to by the leader of the Jews in Alsace in France. And his name was Serf Baer. And he was a well-to-do community leader of the traditionalist variety. And he said the French government is not going to make a new law, a new gezerah, on top of the existing ones against us. You're Mendelssohn. You know how to write French. You know how to do it right. You'll have a name. Write a letter to the French government and do what you need to do to get them to change this. And Mendelssohn was a smart person. He said, I'll do it together with a friend of mine who's not Jewish. His name was Christian Wilhelm Dohm, who was a member of the Prussian government. and that'll give it more of a believability if it's coming from someone who's not Jewish. And it worked. It worked. And this, for the first time, made him focus on what is it the Jewish community wants. Until then, as I've been saying over and over, last class and this class, there had existed for centuries after centuries a giant quid pro quo. The Jews accepted discrimination in exchange for autonomy, which involved coercion. And now, what he was saying was, let me ask you the following question. What would be the ideal political situation for a traditionalist Jew in Europe? And what would be their ideal situation? One in which you have no discrimination, but you still keep the autonomy. Right? Instead of charging us 10 times the taxes that everybody does, make the same taxes, or 2 or 3 times as much. Right? That would be considered a big chesed, but let us keep the kihula, let us keep the autonomy, let's keep the coercion, let's keep everything that we've been used to. And Mendelssohn, in this appeal to the French government, said that. He said, ease up on the discrimination, but let them keep the autonomy. But he himself, once he started to think on this, we're talking in 1779, Thomas Jefferson's already written the Declaration of Independence. These ideas are out in the air. John Locke is already operating, was long dead already, and Montesquieu was running around. The ideas of what you will call, again, to use a code word, liberty, equality, and fraternity. The ideas of religious liberty, that the state should not force anybody to believe anything. It shouldn't enter into the mind. See, God created the mind inside. Nobody can see it. That means he meant it to be secret. It's my business, not yours. These kind of arguments, which pop up in the Enlightenment, he began to subscribe more and more to. And in 1783, he ends up publishing, in 1785 particularly, he writes a book called Jerusalem, in which he advocates, he says, we should do away with the coercion. The Jewish communities, we should get more rights, less discrimination. We should retain the communities, but do away with the coercion. How you do that is a separate question. But do away with the coercion because coercion is not appropriate. That is the beginning of what I'll hope to try in the next class. That is the beginning of a trend which will sweep the European Jewish communities, in which coercion will be thrown out the window. Either by the Jews themselves, well, it never happens by the Jews themselves, never. It always happens by the government, by the state. They will deprive all the Jewish communities of the coercive powers and enact other fundamental reforms that I'll hopefully get to. And this will radically change traditionalism. Because if you deprive it of its cultural insularity, if you deprive it of its coercive communities, and if you deprive it of its very narrow definition of Jewish culture, it ain't what it was.
Thanks very much. Before anybody leaves, let me remind you that the next in this series of lectures is 2 weeks from tonight, on Motzi Shabbos, December 1st, same time, same place, we think. And I've also been tell people when the daily minyanim are. Sunday at 8 o'clock, Monday and Thursday at 6:45, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday at 6:55, except, of course, this Thursday, Thanksgiving, when we start at 8 o'clock. And Monroe is at 9 o'clock. So now we'll turn it over to questions and don't forget the refreshments in the back. Yeah, I'll call on the people. I hesitate to ask the rabbi whether he'd consider Hertzberg's conceded. But I can assure you that despite what he said earlier, when he says something, when he tells us to do something, we listen. Not so the president, but so I had to get that in. Questions? Yes. I'll repeat it. The decimation of the Jews in Germany, of Germans, wasn't that part of the plague as opposed to?
The plague was in the 1300s. The 30 Years' War was in the 1600s. After 300 years, the plague was over. Nothing left. Beg pardon? Happened in the 1300s.
Did the Hasidic movement have anything to do with the joy of?
Of course it did, but that's not the end I was talking about. I will talk about that, I guess, the next lecture, I suppose. Something like that. But that doesn't take away from the radical and revolutionary nature of this phenomenon and its critique of traditionalism.
Next. Yes.
Rizal himself, he was not Sephardi.
Yeah, Rizal himself, was he a Sephardi?
The answer is yes. By I know what you mean, by Geza, by family, if they trace it back to Lorraine or someplace like that. But he lived all his life, and his parents conduct themselves as Sephardic Jews. And his father, you may remember, died when he was a baby, and he moved at a young age to Egypt, where his mother's brother was a big shot with the government over there. It was all Sephardic communities, you understand? And he studied the Shita Professor of Sal Ashkenaz, who was a Sephardic. And all of his life, he was conducting himself as Sephardic. So what his genealogy was is not significant.
That's 3 years such. Is there any, what connection would you say the chapter 3 had with the Hasidic movement? That's one question. The other question also is, I was always told that one of the problems was that whereas the Misnagdim took much more importance, considered much more importance the idea of Torah learning, the Hasidim, the way of the Rebbe was not the greatest Talmud Chacham, but the Dayan was the Talmud Chacham in the town. Was the lesser of importance of the of Torah learning as such in the Hasidic world.
That's the old discredited history. People don't write that. You're thinking of Dubno and people wrote 100 years ago who didn't understand what Hasidism really was. It's changed the profession since times of Martin Buber, and that's all wrong. No, you know today that's simply a mistake. People like the Baal Shem Tov, but particularly the early big Rebbes, the ones who founded the movement, the Maggid of Mezrich, the Noam Elimelech, and Levi Yitzhak Berditchever, were renowned Talmudists, were absolutely a member of the Talmudic elite, who were won away from the Talmudic elite by the dynamism of Hasidism. So this notion is old and discredited. I know what you're talking about, but it's just incorrect. Hasidism made a big appeal to scholars as well as non-scholars. And what was the first part about Shabtai Tzvi? That's too difficult to go into now. I mean, no, seriously, that's a very good question, and I'm sure you know that the early Hasidim were accused of Sabbatianism, but they weren't. So, that issue constantly was out there, and its opponents threw that at them very often, and one could discover in a purely intellectual fashion certain common elements between the two, but they're ultimately not significant. Because today, we're 300 years later, it did not develop into a Sabbatian movement. They don't look at Shabtai Tzvi as Messiah or anything like that, and the way Sabbatians were majorly doing in the 1700s.
Yes, the lady raising her hand.
You mentioned women's rights and education, and that's something that's very close to my heart. I have to mention that the weirdos in my all-women's seminary learn Gemara at night, and I would like to know when the women's education movement started pre-Beis Yaakov, because I know that Yavna was pre-Beis Yaakov.
When did the women's Beis Yaakov, pre-Beis Yaakov begin?
Stay tuned.
Another question.
Linda Sapp.
It seems like that in the Hasidic movement, it was just like a dynasty where it was family, and it's more like the kingship that the Jews had just left. I mean, the Jews were part of that in the Middle Ages, but that they assumed, am I off base?
That comes primarily later. That's not so much in the 1700s. It was very little of that. There were certain strands of it, but that becomes one of the main aspects of Hasidism in the 1800s, the founding of dynasties. Shem Tov is much more fluid. Just to give you one example, the Baal Shem Tov did not leave a son who succeeded him.
Several more questions in the back of the room.
Yeah. I'm not sure I understand the relationship between the Kabbalah and the Hasidic movement. Is it that the Hasidic movement takes the Kabbalah more seriously, whereas everyone else does not?
What is the relationship between the Hasidic and the Kabbalistic movement?
That's an easy one. It's a very complex question, but to give you, in a nutshell, as they say, Hasidus is a Kabbalistic movement. It's a certain way of understanding and implementing Lurianic Kabbalah. That's what it is. You understand? It is not the only way it's done, but it is one way it's done, historically, it is the most popular and most dynamic modern Kabbalistic movement. It's not Madonna, it's the Hasidus.
The back of the room.
Can I talk about Napoleon, how Napoleon fits into this?
Something about Napoleon, could you repeat that?
Is the rabbi going to speak about how Napoleon fits into this?
Will the rabbi speak about how Napoleon fits into this whole scheme?
You mean Napoleon Bonaparte or Napoleon's? With that you'll have to ask. Yeah, sure. The answer is yes. But he's not a very big. He's a part of the story. He's not a very big part of the story. This is not high school. Right? He's not a big part of the story.
And one more, please. Sorry, over here. Yes.
Have you spoken about the big role in Hasidism, both played by Kamalitsky and Tach?
Yeah, you're saying is Hasidism a reaction to the Khmelnytsky aspect? The answer is no. Again, that's the old way. That's part of what he's talking about. That is all dated. You're talking about what people wrote in history books literally a century ago. People like Dubnov, Horodetsky, and many others. This was their way of trying to explain how Hasidism evolved. It didn't. For example, it's like 50 years later, 60, 70, 80 years later. By that time, Polish Jewry had recovered. We don't even know today how many Jews were killed in the Khmelnytsky massacre. Everyone is too much, but it wasn't the huge numbers that once upon a time was thought. So it was a traumatic experience, no question about it. But to say that Hasidism, if you're right, then it should have happened in the 1650s or 60s. You see what I'm saying? I'll take two more and then we'll close it. I know you were waiting there, Mr. Elbaum. I'm going to reward good behavior. I'm a teacher.
I'm just curious, with the difficulties that the Jews had in all these countries, why didn't more Jews try to move to more friendly areas? And one of the things that's in my mind is it's around that time that I believe the Jews first came to the United States in the 1600s, is that correct? From Brazil, right? And why didn't more Jews, unless they did try to come here, I don't know, but why didn't they make that?
Yeah, he's saying, why did the Polish Jews move to America?
Why didn't?
Why did they not? Obviously, the answer is, how hard it was to do that. Look at the map. No, I'm not being funny when I say it. The number of Jews who moved to the United States, let's put it this way. When the first federal census was taken by the new United States government, there were a grand total of 3,000 Jews in the entire United States. So nobody moved. Not the Ashkenaz, not the Sephardim, not any numbers. By the way, here's a trivia question. What was the largest Jewish community in 1790 in the United States? Charleston. Okay, and I'm going to ask Seymour also. He's going to fudre me a I can't hear you.
Basically emerged amongst the Sephardim minority.
I didn't say it emerged amongst the Sephardim.
Well, that's where the Zohar started.
Yeah, not Hasidism.
The sinner of the...
Not Hasidism.
Okay, so in other words, did it affect the Eidu?
I said it was all in the kingdom of Poland over there. That's not
How come
Sephardim.
it did not affect the Eidu Mitzrayim? The Jews who are real Sephardim.
The answer to that is simple.
What's the question?
No, he says, how come Hasidism didn't hit the Sephardim? It did, meaning they already Lurianized a century earlier. Remember I said that they reinvented themselves.
They don't go dressed like Hasidim.
I understand that, because since it happened in a different context a century earlier, there was no need to imitate what Polish Jews are doing. Hasidism has the dress of Polish Jewry because it had popped up in Poland. Understand? If you wanted to see to some extent what a Polish Jew looked like in the 18th century, you go to Far Park, you go to Williamsburg. No, that's what they say. That's what they want to do, right? But that's what they want to do. Hungary and Poland, the Hungarian Jews, as you know, immigrated primarily from Poland in the early 19th century. You see what I'm saying? The Hasidism hit where it hit, and therefore has the cultural, paraphernalia. Had it started in America in the 20th century, the Hasidim would dress Well, like yeshiva cars, with black hats or something like that. It's because it arose where it arose with its geographical differentiation and its chronological differentiation, it looked Polish. It never hit the Sephardic world because the Sephardics accepted all this without any fights. And with this I'll conclude. When you had the big fights between the Vilna Gaon and the Hasidim on the one hand, the Misnagdim sent letters to Israel. And they said that groups of Hasidim, which are dangerous subversives, are moving to Israel and watch out for them. This is when Menachem Mendel Vitebsker and others moved in 1777 to began the Aliyah of the Hasidim. And the Sephardim wrote back, what's weird about these people? Oh, they changed the Siddur to the Arizal, they're switching the Minhagim, they're putting Hodah before Baruch Shamar, and the Sephardim says, so what's wrong with that?
Thanks very much, everyone, for coming. One parting shot of the Hasidus we practice here. You can dress whatever way you want when you come to shul, but I understand that Rabbi Hertzberg was never a Yankee fan. So you can't be a Yankee fan. Thank you all for coming. Refreshments in the back.